Hey guys, I wanted to talk to you all about what my reason was for getting suspended on Twitch and also what my plans are going forward. I think this has been something that's a long time coming. I think that I've been slowly devolving into the most psychopathic version of myself. I think that I've been devolving into this. I don't like making apologies because I think words don't matter. But I do think changed actions and changed behaviors do. And so you can take my apology as hopefully better content. And if you're not seeing that, I want you to hold me accountable. Hopefully this time I won't be stupid enough to ignore it. Milk is pretty dry. Anyway, I'm just going to focus on myself for a while, try to improve my own life. You guys deserve a much better version of me than what you've been getting. And I hope that I can live up to that in the future.
Well, welcome to Give Them an Argument, hosted by Ben Burgis. I am not Ben Burgis. I wish I was.
Neither am I. Wait.
Yeah.
Neither am I. What happened?
It would be pretty sick to be Ben Burgis. It would be sick for all of you guys because then that would mean that Ben is here. But Ben is not. Ben is currently, I believe, in the air, which could mean a lot of things. But in this case, it means he's in the air, not on the air. He's on a plane. So he cannot be here right now. He might make a surprise, less of a surprise because I just said it, but guest appearance in between flights. But don't worry, you will not be hearing from us the entire episode. You will be hearing from Ben. He recently, kind of like most substitute teachers, I will be putting on a video for the class, which is a debate that Ben did with Keith Knight, who is, I believe, the editor-in-chief of the Libertarian Institute. So they were debating socialism v. capitalism, as Ben tends to do. So we're going to get to that pretty quickly. But before that, I want to introduce both myself. I am Jake Appett. I am the super producer of this program, substitute host. And to my right, I have my good pal, J. Andrew World. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. J. Andrew also should be mentioned is designer. What else would you say you do on this? You do a lot of stuff.
I
co-host,
garbage
collector. Yeah.
In case you're wondering what you saw before that, Ben would have greenlit that no matter what because Ben loves the channel. It's a former guest of the show. Ammon Video, I think is his name.
Ammon Hawk. Yeah.
Ammon Hawk. That's it. My apologies. Yeah. I actually am feeling a little under the weather today, so I'm not.
It's okay. I think we all are. Yeah. So what you just saw is him kind of parodying a recent situation with a Twitch streamer named Asmongold. Is that right?
Yes.
So who is that real quick? So we're going to watch the rest of that video just because we love to feature all of Ammon Hawk's videos. And then we're going to get to the debate featuring Ben, which was previously recorded. But what's going on with this guy?
So he's a video game streamer who decided he's going to enter the world of politics.
That's always a good pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah. He's best known for being actually a pretty good gamer, like credit where credit's due, but he does live in absolute filth.
Okay, nice.
Apparently there's like cockroaches that have like walked across the camera during streams and crawled across him. And there's believe me, as you see the rest of it, I don't want to spoil anything. There is truly a disgusting living condition that he's in. And I really actually sincerely do hope that like he gets help for that.
Right. How much of the people we talk about on the show can we kind of put a tag on it of, and sincerely, I hope they get help. So like, there's a lot of people we talk about that I hope they get the help they need is a good final thing to say about them.
Okay, I'm just very concerned about that living condition.
On the Asmongold beat. So yeah, if you haven't seen Eamon Hawke's videos before, he does a lot of really awesome videos where the audio is almost completely not of his own creation. Usually it will be, politicians, various streamers, YouTubers, talking heads, taking their actual audio and animating it. And we love his work. So we're going to show you the rest of the video that played during the cold open. And then after that, we're going to transition pretty quickly into the debate that Ben did with Keith Knight.
Man, it's been a crazy 2 weeks, I'll tell you that. Trump is, he's coming out with some plans. This is the time where you can say elections have consequences. We are in for 4 years of some of the best content that I think we've seen in a long time. So like they're doing this thing with like these deportations where they bring in like celebrities to deport people, and it made me wonder, what is the probability that Tom Homan would let me go with him dressed up as Ash Ketchum with watching them do deportations? Yeah, exactly. That'd be really good content. It would be. Your statement about not voting to disadvantage yourself is really blowing up on X with strong support. Well, of course it is. Of course, it's just a logical perspective to have. Now, there's a bunch of emotionally unstable retards on the internet that like to distort reality. But no, of course, I'm not going to vote for somebody who's going to say that someone else is going to have a privilege that I can't have. Why the fuck would I ever do that? That's the most retarded thing you can imagine. So, no, of course, that's like, I mean, why don't I just vote to have somebody shoot me? Holocaust was a lie. I am, guys, I'm not one of these Holocaust deniers. I think the Holocaust probably happened. I think probably 99% certainty it happened.
The Nazis burned books on gender sciences.
They did do that. It's a bit of a miss. Like, my understanding is that they burned them not because it was gender stuff, but because it was written in Jewish and not German. Look at this. People wonder, are tax dollars used to promote wokeness in video games? Answer is yes. USAID paid Politico millions of dollars a year to write pieces like this one, which promotes diversity and describes Gamergate as disinformation and harassment campaign. So this is the thing, guys. I want these people to suffer because that's what they did to me. Get rid of them. Make an example of them. Say, listen, this is what happens. Gamers rise up. What goes around? Yep, what goes around comes around. And we're coming. Mute the stream for about a minute if you don't want to hear something really bad. So I walked down to the store the other day, and I could tell that the back of my pants, my dick and balls, was getting a little bit too cold. Now that doesn't happen a lot. And I look and I realize part of the back of my sweatpants had been eaten away because we had a rat infestation in our house. And one of the rats had gotten trapped in my room, and it had eaten, I guess, sweat and dried cum off of the back of my sweatpants, and the entire back of it was gone. Incel attitude? Well, I guess I'm an incel. And I think everybody else should be too. And if there's enough of us, we can change the rules. And I think that's what we should do. Do I want my tax money going towards litigating people that like lollies? No. I think that if you're in this country and you commit any crime that's worse than jaywalking and you're not a citizen, I want you deported. Yep. Get the fuck out. People used to bring their families to watch lynchings. People are more than willing to do something that's horrible if they think that they're doing it for the right reason.
I don't know if Ben actually saw that video before he gave us the go ahead to play it. I had not watched the whole
he's
thing
just
yet.
like, oh, it's Eamon Hawke, let's go.
Yeah. When he watches this back, I hope he's a happy man. I think he will be. That was pretty awesome. Definitely Kafka-esque. As Luke said, I think that the reference was there. Jem says, "Tell me he doesn't." Yeah, I mean, when someone like that says "our house," I'm imagining just like roommates, like lots and lots of roommates. But that would be concerning too. All right. Well, I'm not sure if I ever want to hear about that person ever again. But there was a lot of artistry there, so I'm glad that we played that video. Okay, so without much further ado, we are going to play the main event of the night. We're going to watch together Ben's recent debate with Keith Knight, editor-in-chief of the Libertarian Institute. I don't know. I didn't know that an institute could have an editor-in-chief. I thought they'd have.
I mean, if it's a school newspaper, but
yeah,
isn't that a student's job? I don't know.
yeah. I don't think. I don't think that was. I don't think they get to the bottom of that during this debate. How an institute could have an editor-in-chief. Maybe chime in if you know. Anyway, as you can see, we're joining this video a little bit of the way in. This is actually where they start like their crosstalk, like back and forth, where the fireworks fly, where things get exciting. People have their minds changed. I used to like socialism, now I like capitalism, or I used to like capitalism, now I like socialism. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of that, a lot of minds changed. Anyway, unless Andy, you got anything else, I think we can go straight into the debate.
No, let's roll it.
Let's move on to our first challenge question for Keith, the inequality question. Keith, the richest 1% keep getting richer under capitalism, while many others struggle. A handful of billionaires have more wealth than billions of the world's poor. Keith, does capitalism inherently create extreme inequality? And if so, is that just the price that we have to pay for overall progress? Or is it a problem that the free market will eventually fix? Critics say this inequality is a moral failing of capitalism. How do you respond?
I don't think it's unique to capitalism. Every society that I've looked into, start with the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, there was massive inequality. In Greece, the average person was very unequal to Aristotle. In China, the average person was very unequal to Chairman Mao. In Cambodia, the average person was very unequal to Pol Pot. In Argentina, the average person is very unequal to Javier Milei. In all of these examples, every society, we see massive amounts of inequality because of the iron law of oligarchy that I mentioned earlier. Very few people, very domineering personalities are willing to allocate the time and resources it takes to really mobilize people. It's an inevitability in any society. What makes capitalism different is it creates the incentive for those elites to meet consumer demand and worker demand, as which I appreciate, Ben, reprioritizing in my mind to not just think of people as consumers. But there's nothing inconsistent about thinking of people as consumers and workers. I both want them to have more options. I want them to have more time to allocate, whether it's to family, to just reading, to relaxing, or whether they want higher incomes. So no, inequality is not unique to capitalism at all.
Our next challenge question for Ben pertains to authoritarianism. Try that again. Our next question for Ben pertains to authoritarianism versus democracy. Critics warn that socialism, even if started democratically, leads to authoritarianism because the state gains massive control over the economy and thus people's lives. They say power corrupts, and a socialist government might trample individuals' rights, free speech, property, and so forth, in order to reshape society. Ben, how would your vision of socialism avoid devolving into a dictatorship of bureaucrats or a big brother state? For instance, if the government or worker councils were to control resources, what checks and balances would ensure that we don't get a new ruling class in the name of equality? Put another way, how do you have socialism without the secret police and the bread lines? You have 2 minutes.
Oh, I absolutely agree that power corrupts. That's why democratic socialists like me were so ferociously critical of Stalinism during the 20th century, but it's also why we object to a boss having dictatorial power over his workforce. Okay, but the question wasn't about economic authoritarianism of the kind that's foundational to capitalism. It was about authoritarianism in the political sphere. How do you prevent political authoritarianism if you have socialism at the base of the economy? I'd say exactly the same way you prevent it if you have capitalism at the base of the economy. A quick glance around the world shows that newspapers or television stations being privately owned, for example, is no obstacle whatsoever to them being censored by the government. Conversely, there are democracies with state-funded broadcasters that have pretty strong institutional protections of their editorial independence from the government. And of course, the form of socialism I advocate could have plenty of media outlets that were totally independent, subscriber-funded news collectives. As I've said, we have exactly one example in the whole history of the world of something that can maybe be seen as an attempt to create a democratic form of socialism, giving rise to an authoritarian regime, and that was a country, what was the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, where you had no prior tradition of democracy, not even a single year of Russia being a democracy in between pre-revolutionary authoritarianism and post-revolutionary authoritarianism. And sorry, I am going to have to take a minute or two out of my overtime budget here because I really want to point out just a few more things about this case and the broader issue. Russia is a place that started with a backwards semi-feudal economy where World War I had ravaged it to the point of absolute state collapse, and then 14 foreign countries invaded them after their revolution. That's your one and only example of a socialist experiment degenerating into authoritarianism rather than just starting out that way. Meanwhile, there are many, many examples all around the world of capitalist democracies backsliding in some form of political authoritarianism while staying capitalist. In fact, often the dictators come to power with the support of big capitalists precisely because capitalists worry that the alternative will be socialism. That's how Germany got Hitler, and it's how Chile got Pinochet. So the idea that this is more likely to happen under socialism than capitalism is just not supported by any historical evidence. But either way, how do you stop it? What's the guarantee in any country that once you've achieved democracy, you won't backslide into authoritarianism? Constitutional protections of civil liberties and multi-party democracy are important, of course, but the sad truth is that at the end of the day, words in constitutional documents are only as good as the appetite of institutions and ordinary citizens to stand up to protect those rights when authoritarian politicians start to chip away at them. But I do want to make one last point about this. I think if we're going to ask what kind of economic system is more likely to give you the kind of citizenry that would fight to protect their democratic rights in the political sphere, one where people are accustomed to democracy in their own lives, or one where they're habituated every day to obedience to an unelected boss, I think the question tends to answer itself.
The next challenge question for Keith is exploitation or fair exchange. Socialists often argue that capitalism is essentially exploitation. Owners reap the profits while workers get paid a fraction of the value they actually produce. Keith, why do you disagree with the claim that wage labor under capitalism is akin to a form of theft or wage slavery? What's your argument that a voluntary paycheck is fair exchange and not exploitation? You have 2 minutes.
When someone signs up to take a class by Mr. Burgis, they will inevitably spend thousands of hours doing hard work for $0 and 0 cents an hour. This could be seen as totally exploitative. Mr. Burgis is getting paid, and they're not only not getting paid, they have to take out big loans in order for the school to make tons of money. That could be exploitation. Or you could say that's a choice that someone made because given the alternatives they had, they thought this was a valuable use of their time and money. I see nothing wrong with this at all. So when we see someone in a vulnerable situation, maybe taking bad working conditions or a bad wage, it is tempting to say, let's outlaw that. Once that is outlawed, the people don't end up owning mansions and skipping through meadows, singing the Sound of Music soundtrack. They end up being in a worse position than they previously were because you took away the one option they had. So given the fact that people can constantly experience exploitation in their everyday life, let's assume exploitation exists, and it's when one person with more power exploits someone with less power. Because if it's just money, you would have to say that stay-at-home moms exploit the surplus value of their husbands. Welfare recipients exploit the surplus value of net taxpayers. We could play that game, or we could just say, if human beings, a good default position is if human beings arrive at a mutually beneficial, actually, let's scratch that. Any voluntary exchange where one person has the recognized to opt out or the choice to contract with other people without the threat of violence being used against them, I think that's a much better default position to have. Because, of course, I think the state claiming the right to take 30% of your income is very, very exploitative. Or you could say that the employees are exploiting the bosses. They just go to a place only because those employees want the money from the bosses. If they don't like the job, they'll just pick up and quit. They don't care if the company is operating at a loss. The worker doesn't have to, pay the money that the company loses. And most companies are unprofitable and most companies go under. Are they exploiting the employer? The employer has to do tons of unpaid investment, research and development, coming up with the concept of an idea of what to sell, training people on the job before ever getting paid from the product they're selling. You could say that the employer is being exploited by the employees who are just there selfishly for their own paycheck, and the customers who just walk into the store. Maybe I'll buy something, maybe I won't. I just care if these people can give me resources. I don't see anything nefarious about that. So while it could be seen as unequal, I still respect people's right to freely associate.
Ben, I have another prepared question for you, but I've got a feeling you want to take a minute on exploitation.
Yeah, thanks. So if you read Karl Marx's Capital, which is all about exploitation, Marx's point is absolutely not that what goes on in the labor market isn't a fair market exchange. Never mind that people are being selfish, they don't care about each other, anything like that. His whole claim is that precisely that even if what goes on in the labor market does follow the laws of market fairness, it's still a form of exploitation. Here's how that argument goes. What's the commodity that workers are selling in the labor market? Marx thinks it's their labor power. In other words, their general capacity to work for some period of time. If you rent a margarita machine for a party, what you're paying for is the use of the machine over a certain length of time, not necessarily the number of margaritas that you end up using it to make. Same deal when you rent a human being for 40 hours a week. And Marx says, okay, what's the fair market value of renting a human being? Whatever it takes to maintain that human at a reasonable level of subsistence. But even if they're paid that much, so market exchange fairness isn't violated, it still remains the case that some of the revenue the worker is making for the firm pays back their wages, but there's also part of it that goes beyond that. That's the capitalist profits. Otherwise, why hire the worker? So just like the feudal serf, the modern worker spends part of his time working for himself and part of it working to enrich the ruling class. And since most people don't start out with enough funds to start to own their own means of production, they have no realistic choice but to submit to this arrangement to make a living. That's what Marx means by exploitation, forced extraction of labor by a ruling class.
I want Mr. Burgis and I to go back and forth on this because I feel like we're very close to settling the capitalism and socialism debate that's been going on for centuries. But if we could at least get this down, just for points of clarity. If I work at a company and the company's operating at a loss as opposed to a profit, is there exploitation going on?
So I think that the claim about exploitation is going to be not that at any given moment, right? It's that you're necessarily making a profit. I mean, just the same way that I'm sure from your perspective, if it turns out that any given year, right, the government is let's say spending more on its tax collection service than it's actually making in taxes, I'm sure that wouldn't detract from your feeling that there was theft going on, right? The point is that the system runs on the extraction of surplus labor from the working class, not that at any given time it's necessarily successful.
Assume I'm a consumer under democratic socialism,
Mm.
and I don't necessarily It's not that I don't care about the well-being of the workers. I just don't have the mental energy to say,
Sure.
all right, how many people went into making these AirPods? I don't know them. I'm just going to a place because I want a product for myself. And I will only pay an amount of money that I am willing to give because I value this product more than the money I'm exchanging. Am I, as a consumer under democratic socialism, engaged in monetary or philosophical exploitation?
No, also not if you're doing that under capitalism. You're not actually extracting anything from people from workers because you don't own the place. But I do just want to pause on this example to note that what you just gave is a really excellent explanation of why just people making consumer choices isn't a good strategy for remedying injustice. That people are not, when they're buying the AirPods or whatnot, right? It's just not realistic to think that in that scenario people are going to be thinking about exactly who's being paid what or anything like that, right? Which is why, to solve that kind of collective action problem, you need people to come together in the political sphere in order to enact those kinds of preferences.
If assume that I am a huge admirer of Liam Crosgrove, which I absolutely am, and I want to see him in person just eviscerate Matt Miller as he did so many times at the State Department. I want this so much, but he's not a rich guy. So I'm willing to intern for Liam at $0.00 an hour. Would I have the right to do that under democratic socialism?
Would you have unpaid internships? Maybe. I mean, that's the kind of question that's so fine grained. I don't think that there's a sort of general answer to it, that they have or indeed, I mean, look, you could even have outright wage labor, in some parts of the economy. The objection is to, I mean, certainly, if you have somebody who performs some minor service, for a firm, but it's not really their job. They might provide this service for any number of different firms. It might not be realistic or reasonable to think that they're going to get voting rights, at all of them, or even necessarily any of them. But the objection is not, do you have a single internship going on anywhere in the economy? Do you have a single instance of wage labor going on anywhere in the economy? Is the overall economic structure such that most of the population has no realistic means of supporting themselves except to submit to economic dictatorship through wage labor?
Under democratic socialism, wouldn't I have to submit to the collective of the grocery store? Before I used to work at a grocery store.
Sure. Me
So
too.
wouldn't they only hire me or vote to hire me if they thought the value I brought exceeded the cost of employing me? How is that any different?
How is that any different? Well, I think that as a worker owner, right, you have a say in dictating wage levels. In other words, that they have that you could actually vote on what the wage scales are, right? So the fruits of your collective labor, right? You have a say in deciding, right? It's the private sector version of no taxation without representation. So presumably, they think that they think in voting to hire you that that the result of this will be that all of you, including you, right, will make more for all of them, right? But the point is that it's not being extracted from you by virtue of just the class power of owners. Rather, you yourself have a reasonable voice and vote in setting the distribution of the proceeds.
When I look at the things in the world that I really value, whether it's the show Seinfeld, whether it's the computer that I'm using, whether it's books that I like or houses that I live in, a lot of those did not come about as a result of a democratic vote. It's a few people employing scarce resources, other people more or less following orders while being employed. If I like that kind of arrangement, because I don't want my life filled with meetings where we're all debating every little piece of minutia, couldn't you just allow people to engage in capitalist acts between consenting adults without coercively democratizing them if people just think it's a more efficient way of organizing?
Well, I think I heard two different arguments there. One was about the production of the products themselves, that, that these things were produced by this system, where there's a sort of implicit worry that, a different system, wouldn't generate the same results. And of course, that's an argument I'm very happy to have, but I think it's a little bit different from the point that we're pursuing here about exploitation and voluntariness. And I would say that you have a problem here, because sure, there could indeed be people who prefer not to have a choice. Now, I don't think that workplace democracy means that you have to spend all day in meetings. People who work at Mondragon don't have to spend all day at meetings. You could basically have a big annual meeting or two where you elect a council that runs the place the rest of the time, and might even hire managers where it's more appropriate to use that kind of process because they have particular managerial or technical skills. And you could also vote on an operating agreement, which would be much like a union contract, except you don't have to negotiate it with a separate boss. But look, putting all of that aside, I'd say the problem with that, right, is that if you have too much, right, of that capitalism between consenting adults, as I'm sure you'd recognize, we would just draw opposite conclusions from this. The basic structure of the issue is the same for any, right, workplace regulation, right? That they have whether we're talking about minimum wage, workplace safety laws, child labor, sexual harassment, all of them, right? That it could be, right, that there are people to whom it would be worthwhile, given the choice, right, to accept the arrangements that would violate any of those things, right? But the problem is that that if you're just sort of focused on that micro level and you say, oh, see, whatever, it's all voluntary, then you end up with circumstances where most people have no realistic choice except to submit to those things. That's the problem.
So I'm sorry, Eric, can I ask one more thing just to see if Ben and I can get on the same page about something? Is that okay?
Go for it. This issue of exploitation is explicitly why we gave you guys the extra 20 minutes. We knew this is where you were going to use it.
When I think of, okay, let's forget the state owning the means of production. Let's forget the capitalists. What I would want to look at in order to see if democracy, everyday democracy, worker democracy, if that's something desirable, what I look at, tell me if these are straw men, please do, is I look at what issues were most heavily debated among the population. People don't talk about agricultural subsidies, but so we can exclude stuff like that. The two things that come to mind to me are 9/11 and COVID-19. These were heavily debated and discussed among people in your average day. You could put probably the existence of Donald Trump on there as something people were constantly talking about. It seems like the average person who brought George Bush's approval rating to 91% after he didn't keep us safe on 9/11, the average person was advocating lockdowns and mask mandates, even though there was no correlation between states that locked down and had mask mandates and states that had lower death rates. So it seems like when the average person attempts to get democratically involved, we still get absolutely terrible results in the two examples where people were most democratically involved in society. Should this make us more skepticism of people's willingness to debate in good faith with democracy? Are my examples valid? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that one of those examples is one that we broadly agree on. The other, I suspect there would be more disagreements, but I also suspect it wouldn't be a good use of our time here to go down that rabbit hole. But I think that the general point that there's no guarantee that if you let people engage in democratic self-government, right, make their own decisions about how policies that affect them are going to be. Of course, there's no guarantee that they're going to make good decisions, right? Any more than when it comes to things that you and I would actually agree, are in the private sphere, right? They're things that mostly affect just me, and it's fine for me to make that decision without anybody else's input. There's no guarantee that I'm going to make decisions that that end up being good for me. Of course, humans are fallible, but I don't think the case for democracy rests on some sort of guarantee that people, when they're allowed the right to self-government, will always govern themselves wisely.
Thank you for clarifying. That is the extent to which I wanted to go on this issue. Thank you, Eric.
And I want to thank our producers at Zero Hedge for allowing me the latitude to allow that exchange rather than trying to enforce rigid time limits. That's exactly why I value the Zero Hedge debate series. We have, however, used up a lot of our overtime limit, guys. So let's try to tighten this up. Move on to Ben's next prepared question, which is on economic coordination and innovation. So let's talk nuts and bolts. In a socialist economy, who decides what gets produced, in what quantity, and at what price? Capitalists argue that without the price signal and a profit motive, a socialist system cannot efficiently allocate resources, leading to shortages or waste, and also that stifles innovation, since investors and entrepreneurs can't reap rewards. Ben, what's your response? How would a socialist system figure out, say, how many shoes or microchips to produce and keep innovating new products? Do you envision markets still existing, like co-op businesses competing with one another, or something like democratic planning replacing supply and demand? In short, how will socialism deliver the efficiency and innovation that we see from free market capitalism delivering in its own manner? You have 2 minutes.
So I do take the calculation problem, right? That's the problem of how to efficiently coordinate production with fine-grained consumer needs seriously. And it does shape how I think about how viable socialism could or couldn't work. But I also think that libertarians often wildly overstate the scope of that problem, to the point where they seem to suggest that it means that even the kind of expansion of the public sector you get under social democracy, can't possibly work well. And at that point in the argument, I always think about the scene in the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, where the title character demonstrates step by step with equations on the chalkboard that it must be physically impossible to split atoms, and his colleague, politely waits for him to finish and then says, yeah, we actually just split one in the lab next door, come check it out. Right? We know, for example, that it's possible to do a good job of planning sectors like healthcare and education and getting better results than the free market does, because we've been running this experiment for decade after decade. And by any standard, socialized healthcare is a smashing success. Finland has the best education system in the world. They don't even have private schools, and so on. So there are things we can plan effectively, but the Soviet experience also shows there are some very real limits. I think at this stage in history, we haven't figured out how to get rid of markets entirely without unacceptable inefficiencies. But if we still do need a market sector for consumer goods, it can at least be a market sector of competing internally democratic worker-owned firms, which I think would have to be financed with grants from nationalized banks. That's the model that Bhaskar and Mike and I advocate in that forthcoming book that you plugged when you were introducing me, The Blueprint.
Our next challenge is for Keith. Booms, busts, and bailouts. Capitalist economies have produced incredible growth, but also boom and bust cycles, recessions, panics, the 2008 financial meltdown. When things go wrong, we often see big banks or companies get government bailouts, which hardly seems like free market being in action. Keith, do frequent crises and bailouts mean capitalism is unstable by nature, or were those crises actually caused by government interference in capitalism, in your view? Explain why capitalism shouldn't be judged by events like the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, or if it should, why we should still stick with capitalism despite that kind of turbulence. You have 2 minutes.
The concept that a crisis exists and the solution is to decrease the amount of voluntary exchanges is the classic psychopath test. Anytime a psychopath sees a crisis, they attempt to reap benefits from it at the expense of others instead of creating voluntary avenues for people to resolve the issue. If you have a famine, you could say, well, that was the causal result of capitalism because that's shrinking the economy. Do famines only happen under capitalist societies? Absolutely not. Nor do you have just financial recessions occur in capitalist societies, or wars are a great example of crises that come into existence as a causal result of a deviation from the private property ethic. You coercively fund the wars with taxation, and you violate the private property rights of the people and the buildings you blow up in exchange. So crises are not unique to capitalism. Specifically with financial crises, people will always leave out the existence of a central bank, which has a legal monopoly on the money supply. Why they would ignore half of every exchange or half of most exchanges, which do include money, and the central bank, which creates that money, is a bit of an indicator as to whether or not we're getting an actual culprit when it comes to financial crises. Essentially, the central bank will artificially lower the interest rate, the rate at which banks lend money to each other, to increase the money supply or the amount of money that banks take out as loans. This increase in the money supply means that some things are funded to such a heavy extent that that creates a bubble that would not otherwise exist if the interest rate changed as a result of people choosing to postpone consumption and save more money. When the interest rate is lower and people spend more, well, then that's okay, because you could always raise the interest rate and give people the incentive to save more so they could earn money off that interest. What the state created central bank does is manipulate the interest rate in such a way to where it's the price of money that is changed. Think of the price as a signal wrapped in an incentive. If something has a very high cost, it sends a signal and a potential profit incentive for people to allocate time, money, and resources toward producing that good. That is the closest I could come to approximating one, crises are not unique to capitalism, and even specifically financial crises are not the result of too many voluntary exchanges and a respect for private property.
Our next challenge for Ben is on incentives and hard work. If under socialism, the goal is to equalize wealth and have workers collectively own everything, what incentive is there for someone to work harder or to innovate more than the next guy does? In capitalism, the carrot of profit or a promotion or striking it rich motivates innovation and effort. Ben, how would socialism keep people motivated to do unpleasant but necessary jobs, or just to excel and invent if there's no billionaire jackpot waiting? Do you worry about losing the dynamism that competition brings, or do you think that cooperation can be an even stronger motivator when people share the gains? You have 2 minutes.
Well, like I talked about in my last answer, there are sectors of the economy where I'd acknowledge the best practical solution would be to retain an element of market competition, even after moving to workers' control the means of production. But even apart from that very basic ideological concession, I actually don't think this challenge is quite as formidable as it might look. First, on innovation and invention, think about your smartphone, right? And all the things that make it smart. The GPS, the touchscreen technology, the internet itself, every single one of these elements were innovated in the public sector, in the Defense Department, in public universities, in labs funded with public grants. So we should take the corporate world self-mythologizing about innovation with quite a bit of salt. Second, let's talk about the half of the question about hard work at the bottom of society, about getting people to do the dirty and unpleasant but necessary jobs you alluded to. And I'd make just 2 quick points about that. First, this incentive to hard work doesn't exist for people who are born into money. And that's always struck me as a massive contradiction in hard work rhetoric in defense of capitalism. Second, even worker co-ops don't have 100% flat wage scales right now. And I'm sure in a socialist system where worker ownership was standard in whatever sort of market sector we still had to have, they still wouldn't. For a lot of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, you would have to offer people more money to take those jobs, given greater background economic egalitarianism, than you would to get people to take more pleasant, rewarding, intellectually stimulating jobs. Of course, that's the opposite of how we do it now, since under capitalism, the way we fill those positions is by having the lowest wage part of the workforce at the bottom of society be desperate enough to take any job they're offered.
Our next challenge for Keith is crony capitalism versus free markets. Many critics, especially young people, say that what we have today isn't true free market capitalism at all, but rather crony capitalism, a rigged game where corporations and government elites scratch each other's backs. Keith, how do you distinguish between real capitalism from the cronyism that we see with lobbyists, subsidies, and bailouts? Is it fair for people to blame capitalism for the sins of cronyism? And if true capitalism hasn't been tried because of all this government meddling, well, how can we ever be sure that it actually works?
It's much like saying, how can you really advocate voluntary relationships if rape will inevitably exist? Well, what you do is you have a principle of voluntarism that you enter into such relationships. So if you have a consistent definition of free markets or capitalism, you can clearly see that cronyism comes about to the extent which companies or individuals or any organization acquires property outside of the voluntary exchange or homesteading or contracting ethic. So because you have a definition, you can have a true dividing line between cronyism and capitalism, which I would much more closely define as socialism. I'll use the rest of my time just to say one thing about hard work. Japanese Americans came to America basically not speaking a word of English and were put into internment camps by Franklin Roosevelt from his 9066 executive order. By 1959, they had equaled the incomes of whites, and by 1969, they were earning 33% higher incomes than the average American family. Absolutely, hard work pays off in the long run. Not in every single case, as you corrected me with the intern case. Not every single case comes about in the way that we would like, but these are general trends which we can appreciate. I hope that answers both questions.
We're down to our final questions in this round. Our final challenge question for Ben is on worker cooperatives. Ben, you advocate for firms to be owned and run by their employees. But under today's capitalism, worker co-ops are already legal, and they do exist. Mondragon in Spain, for example. Yet most businesses are still traditional companies with owners and wage workers. If worker-run companies are a superior model, why haven't they naturally outcompeted capitalist firms when they could in today's existing system? Are there structural barriers to capitalism that prevent cooperatives from thriving? Or do people simply prefer the capitalist business model? In other words, is the rarity of co-ops in today's society evidence that capitalism actually works better? Or is it just that capitalism's playing field is tilted against worker ownership? How would socialism change that equation? You have 2 minutes.
To me, asking why didn't market competition produce workplace democracy if workplace democracy would be better is no different than asking why, if it's better to have minimum wage laws and workplace safety laws and sexual harassment laws and laws against child labor and the rest, why didn't the invisible hand of the free market just raise wages and eliminate unsafe labor practices and fire groping bosses and get children out of coal mines without the state having to get involved? And notice there's an exact parity of reasoning here. After all, before minimum wage laws, employers were legally allowed to pay that higher wage. Before child labor laws, coal mining companies were free to only hire adults. No law stopped secretaries who were tired of being harassed by their bosses from starting competing companies with strict harassment policies. The basic lesson in all of these cases is just that because something is better in human terms, it obviously doesn't follow that doing it gives you an edge in market competition. In fact, sometimes the opposite is true. There's a reason slavery wasn't transcended in the South by having free labor cotton farms outcompete slave plantations. In the worker co-op example, it's a lot easier for a firm, for example, to move from place to place in search of better business conditions, higher profits, if the people who get a vote about whether to do that aren't people who would either lose their jobs or have to pick up their entire lives and move if the firm moves. Similarly, being able to pay sub-minimum wages and cut corner on safeties, for example, makes companies that can do these things more profitable. Without the state stepping in to even the playing field, market incentives will actually tend to punish these things. And I'm going to eat, I know I don't have much left, but I'm going to eat just a little bit more into my overtime budget here to say two things. And first, saying that making a change doesn't give firms an edge is very different from saying that the state coming in to make the change happen will crash the economy. And anyone who thinks that would happen in these cases has a heavy burden of proof. Since the extant evidence from those few really existing worker co-ops that we do have under capitalism doesn't give us an obvious reason to suspect this is the case. Second, what the state coming in to bring, about workplace democracy, like a future socialist government in collaboration with the militant labor movement, what that might look like could involve a few different policy tools, from the blunt instrument of, for example, nationalizing Fortune 500 companies and turning them over to their workers, to just changing the funding mechanism for new firms. So the primary mechanism was getting grants from nationalized banks. And notice that everything I'm talking about nationalizing right now are economic institutions that are the cronyist part of actually existing crony capitalism. Institutions propped up by massive state intervention. So even from a libertarian perspective, I'm not sure how many tears you could cry for their lost property rights if this ever happened.
Our final challenge question to Keith is about people over profits. A common critique is that capitalism puts profits before people. For example, companies might pollute the environment or squeeze workers to cut costs, hurting communities. Keith, what's your response to the charge that capitalism, by design, values money over humanity? Do market forces eventually punish bad actors like consumers boycotting a polluter? Or do we need something beyond capitalism to protect people and planet from greed? In your view, can capitalism solve problems like climate change? Or does addressing such issues require moving away from pure free markets? You have 2 minutes.
Again, it is not about profit which makes capitalism unique, because socialists, syndicalists, communists, fascists are always looking to increase the amount of money or property or social status that they have. So again, profit is not unique to capitalism, but the freedom to disassociate with bad actors is unique to free market capitalism, what I'm advocating here. If you look at the earliest computers, microphones, radios, and printers that were ever invented, they took many, many more resources out of the environment than that which occurs today. This was not the result of the state saying you have to save more money in the vast majority of examples. It was entrepreneurs responding to the voluntary profit incentive through competition, which resulted in more efficient products available to more people in more countries than ever before. If you care about the environment, make sure that environmentalists have tons of options in where they can buy their products and how they can spend their scarce money, and make sure that it's profitable for employers to respect the environment by using very green energy, which can save on steel, iron, aluminum, the number of inputs that go into the final production process. So people over profit I see as a false dichotomy. It's extremely difficult to make profit in the voluntary sector if you're not meeting the demand of other people in the economy.
And now it's time to move on to part 3 of this evening's debate, which I think is probably going to be nearest and dearest to many of our listeners' hearts. This is where we'll focus on the generational crisis of the vast majority of young adults feeling that our current system of governance and wealth distribution, regardless of what ism you want to call it, whatever it's called, it's corrupt and it's in serious need of reform. I'll ask 4 questions on this topic for both debaters to respond to. The first topic is youth versus capitalism. Polls show that young people today are deeply frustrated by the status quo. In Britain, nearly 8 in 10 young adults blame capitalism for the housing crisis, and 2/3 say that they'd prefer a socialist economy. In the United States, Gen Z and millennials have far lower opinions of capitalism than older Americans, with many viewing socialism positively. To both debaters, why do you think that so many young adults have turned against capitalism? Are there grievances such as stagnant wages, student debt, high rent, and climate fears a direct result of capitalism's failures, as they believe? Or are they scapegoating the wrong culprit? And what would you say to the allegation that capitalism is the problem coming from today's youth? We started with Ben in the last round, so let's let Keith kick things off in this round. Keith, you have 2 minutes to respond.
I am 29 years old, so I think I am in this demographic of who you are referring to. When it comes to the things that create the most amount of economic insecurity among me and my friends, it's the big 3 almost always: schooling, housing, and healthcare, the three things that the state is constantly intervening in and increasing its amount of regulations and increasing the amount that it subsidizes. When it comes to schooling, the state in the last 50 years has drastically increased the amount of involvement in education. You could imagine if the Catholic Church had compulsory education, you wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of Catholics going around. So the fact that the state controls education, I'm not too surprised that we see a lot of statists going around. When it comes to the concept of healthcare, people in my generation are extremely furious with the outrageous cost of healthcare. We had a schooling system and a Department of Agriculture which was telling us in order to be healthy, you'll want to eat between 6 and 11 servings of grain per day. That's what socialized medicine has produced in the extent that it currently exists. According to Paul Krugman's book, The Conscience of a Liberal, he says that before Medicare Part D and the Affordable Care Act, the government paid for 44% of healthcare expenses through the VA, through Medicare, through Medicaid. The state is very heavily involved. The problem is not too many voluntary exchanges. In the case of housing, people like Elvis Summers and Jay Austen were creating tiny houses for people so they could just get their foot in the door to have a place to rest, to combat homelessness. And the state, of course, confiscated these because they weren't up to code. That's how socialism tries to reflect the needs of the working masses by confiscating the one opportunity that they choose to live in. So healthcare, housing, and education. And the other healthcare example, of course, is COVID. They attempted to lock us down and stop us from interacting in public for years on end based on absolute ridiculous science, while the EcoHealth Alliance was funding gain-of-function research. The problem is not too many voluntary exchanges. The problem is a lack thereof.
Ben, your turn to address young adults' objections to capitalism. You have 2 minutes.
Well, I think that young adults are probably aware that if you want to talk about the effects of socialized medicine, it's probably less relevant to talk about nutritional advice nobody remembers from elementary school than to talk about where in the world you have more successful health outcomes by every single measure. Where in the world you have the option of leaving your job without worrying about losing your health insurance, etc. But putting that aside, I would say that one of the things I find most striking about this question is how it connects with the question earlier about the relationship between capitalism and socialism and economics, and democracy or authoritarianism in politics. Because it's really striking to me how little the sentiments reflected in those polls are represented in the political sphere. And I don't think it's just because the generation gap and older people voting more. I think it's because the way economic inequality distorts democracy. But as far as what the polls mean, I don't want to overinterpret them, but I do think those numbers are rooted in some really grim realities on the ground. We might not have real capitalism from a libertarian purist perspective, but in the last 50 years of neoliberalism, we have gone a lot closer to that than we were. And every step we've taken in that direction, the privatizations, the deregulation, the gigification, every bit of it has made our society worse, more stressful, more precarious. So whereas I'm under no illusion that most young people in these polls have a clear idea of what a socialist economy would even mean, and I'm sure a lot of them really just mean Nordic-style reforms, I do still think these sentiments reflect a real and well-deserved dissatisfaction with the massive economic inequality and economic precarity that they've grown up with, and a desire to renegotiate the social contracts in a better direction, one that gives more resources and dignity to the working class. My long-term horizons obviously go beyond that, but I do think the majority of young people are on board with at least taking some steps in what I would see as the right direction.
Our next topic relating to the generational crisis is capitalism versus crony capitalism. A lot of young people use capitalism as a catch-all for everything they see wrong. Unaffordable education, corrupt politicians in bed with billionaires, Wall Street bailouts, you name it. But some argue that much of this is cronyism or corruption, not true free market capitalism. Keith, you've noted that after years of schooling and media pushing anti-market ideas, it's truly remarkable that anyone still values free market freedom. Do you think that youth have been taught to blame capitalism for problems actually caused by government intervention and crony elites? How do you explain the difference between free market capitalism and the mixed economy that we currently have to a generation that just sees one big system failing them? You have 2 minutes.
You would want to extract a definition of what you're referring to when you come to capitalism. So, what I would do with them is say, if capitalism is just about making money, does that apply at all to non capitalist enterprises? Do those people just exist as unpaid volunteers? Of course not. They're profit seeking. So it's not about the concept of making money. Is it about a few people making decisions for many other people? Well, we see this in politics all the time, where a very few amount of people make decisions for tons of people who not only don't get a say, don't even know what's taking place, and the information is frequently classified. So, because of their very shallow understanding of capitalism, I would say that that could be an explanation, and the fact that the state gets to coercively fund its schools, whereas other schools have to get money voluntarily. And it has a unique compulsion aspect to school. The last Democratic presidential candidate was bragging about the enforcement of truancy laws. This is coercing kids to spend their time performing child labor for $0 an hour in government schools. So yeah, of course, you could even ask them. So the number of pages in the Federal Register have drastically decreased in the last 50 years since we're, just under capitalism. They'd probably say yes, even though the opposite's true. So government spending has been drastically decreasing because we used to have, somewhat of a mixed economy, and now we're just totally capitalist. They might say, yeah, there's less government spending than ever before. There's, no education budget and everything. Everyone always thinks that these things are shrinking when, of course, education, housing, and healthcare government spending has increased in every aspect. So yes, they're against it because they're ignorant, because they have no incentive to get informed because of democracy. They could spend tons of time getting informed, and yet they would only get a 1 in 10 million vote every 4 years. So I don't necessarily expect that to change. My goal is just to increase the amount of insecurity socialists feel when they're advocating their ideas. Hopefully that would do a better job than really informing people.
Ben, do you accept the distinction between capitalism and crony capitalism, or do you believe that what free marketeers call crony capitalism is just an inevitable outgrowth of capitalism itself? Is saying that's cronyism, not real capitalism, just an excuse to dodge blame? You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. First, I just want to express my astonishment at the idea that the American educational system is pro-socialist. I think this is so at odds with the experience of every human being who's ever been through it that I just don't even know what to say about that. It relentlessly glorifies capitalism. We all know this. But no, I don't think that that's a meaningful distinction. I think that thinking you can have massive economic inequality without it translating into massive inequality in political influence is like thinking water can be taught to flow upstream. The usual libertarian dodge that, we'll make the state less powerful, so therefore it'll be less desirable for moneyed interest to capture, spectacularly misses the point for 2 reasons. And this all goes double for any fantasy of anarcho-capitalism, just having capitalism without a state entirely. First, think about the regulatory capture aspect of the issue. Saying, corporations are going to use their influence to weaken the regulatory agencies to protect workers and consumers, therefore let's get rid of those agencies, is like saying that if half the gangsters in some city are getting away with their crimes by paying off cops and judges, saying, I've got a solution. Let's stop prosecuting gangsters entirely so none of them will then pay anybody off. Second, capitalism can't exist without a very large state. In fact, functioning markets of any kind at a large scale couldn't exist without a big state. If libertarians want to take any kind of ideological credit for the successes of real-world capitalism, they can't just ignore all the ways every flourishing capitalist economy ever has been propped up by the state, ranging from public roads and utilities to state-backed currency to limited liability corporations to all that basic R&D the public sector does that I was talking about earlier. Not to even mention that protecting private property rights in a wildly unequal society is going to take a lot of coercive power. Do you want companies to just have to spend half their budgets on private militias? Otherwise, you're going to need a big state to protect those property rights, and that state is going to get captured. Crony capitalism is just capitalism in the only form it could ever take in a material reality.
Next, let's talk about addressing youth's grievances. Let's get specific with issues fueling this discontent. Sky-high housing costs, crippling student debt, jobs that don't pay a living wage, and the perception of a looming climate crisis. Many young people feel that the system we have now is robbing them of the future their parents enjoyed. I want to hear from each of you. How would your preferred system fix or at least seriously address these problems? Ben, why would moving toward a more socialist system make college affordable, housing accessible, and jobs decent for young people? And can it tackle big challenges like climate change better than capitalism? You have 2 minutes.
Sure. I think even very modest baby steps in the socialist direction would be huge on all of these fronts. But I do slightly object to the framing about making college more affordable. Education shouldn't be a commodity at all. We should have tuition-free public education at all levels, from preschool to graduate school, paid for by progressive taxation and free at the point of service, just like public high school is paid for. That's not some utopian socialist fantasy. That's just Finland. Widely held, by the way, to have the best education system in the world. Similarly, on housing, when people in America think of public housing, they might think of housing projects that were exclusively for the poor and were extremely undesirable, or maybe even think of housing in the USSR, certainly not a good model. But looking around the world, we do have lots of good models, from Singapore to Sweden, of very successful systems where big portions of the population at all income levels live in high quality municipal housing or homes on public land. And these systems get the job done in a way that I'm very deeply skeptical that EMB zoning deregulation could ever be enough to do. On climate change, trying to do an energy transition, by just hoping that, enough people express their green values in their buying decisions, is just not going to be sufficient for anything like the scale of what we need, right? What we need is a massive New Deal style public works program to do a rapid energy transition. And of course, that also ties into the part about the jobs, because we could create lots of good unionized public sector jobs in the process. And these are just the reformist baby steps, actually achieving democracy at work, so people could decide together on how to run the place and who gets how much of the revenue, would be a quantum leap forward in the dignity, autonomy, and material well-being of the vast majority of the population.
Keith, how would a purer form of capitalism or free market policies make life better for young generations specifically? For example, would deregulating housing and education or embracing innovation solve these issues faster than government-driven socialist ideas? Convince our young skeptics out there, and there's plenty of them that are skeptical of capitalism in this audience. How is capitalism going to deliver the goods for them? You have 2 minutes.
We can look at the free education that capitalism provides when it comes to websites online, as I mentioned in my opening statement, YouTube, Odyssey, Internet Archive, the Khan Academy. Using Grok, thanks to people like Elon Musk, we can access more education than we ever could have. If you advocate something like the need for college to be coercively funded by the state, that is an admission that the last 12 years that the kids spent learning absolute nonsense is created people who are in such dire need of education that they absolutely need 4 years, and we need the state to coercively fund it. I would think that you'd want to brag a little more about public education, considering it's 5 days a week, 6 hours a day for 12 years. You'd think that these kids were so brilliant that no politician could ever trick them with propaganda, that they would be immune to falling for logical fallacies and such. But the reality is that the teachers do not have the incentive to create a very good product or service. So after 12 years, kids know so little that the socialist is demanding, oh gosh, we really need 4 more years of this because the last 12 years was such an unequivocal waste. In the case of healthcare, look at the most regulated versus least regulated things. Something like cosmetics is much less regulated and the cost has gone down. More people are able to access it than previously before, because there was market competition, because there was innovation. If you go to Walgreens, you could look at the stuff that the state does not require a prescription for versus what the state does require a prescription to get. Less regulation, more options, and lower costs as a result of competition. And with housing, as I mentioned earlier, people like Elvis Summers, Jay Austen, it's not that these those are two people who were building tiny houses for the cost of between $1,200 and $5,000. This would have come about just as smartphones. Gordon Gekko's brick phone in Wall Street was impressive 40 years ago, and now no one would be caught dead with that. That's the innovation that capitalism can yield us. Or you could say, well, actually, it's not the profit incentive, it's people just wanting better things for the future. That's totally fine. Then just fund those voluntarily. Just let us opt out of what, frankly, we think are just disasters, such as, state schooling. I think it's a complete waste of time, and it's unpaid child labor. And I would much rather kids have jobs when they were much younger, getting their foot in the door and getting on the job experience so they could gain skills in the workplace. Just let us opt out. That's the only capitalism response that I have.
Our final topic in this round will be an elevator pitch to the next generation. Imagine you're speaking directly to a 22-year-old who's watching this debate and feeling frustrated and cynical about their economic future. They're asking, what does your side have to offer me personally? Why should I believe in capitalism or socialism? Keith, what hope can capitalism give to that young person who's worried about inequality, climate, and living standards? You have 2 minutes to sell your case before the elevator arrives at your executive suite on the top floor.
For the same reason we should have religious freedom, we should have economic freedom. People should be free to make voluntary exchanges with their friends, their coworkers, their employers, with potential customers, in the absence of a third party coercively intervening and attempting to exploit both consenting parties. I'm very happy that the Me Too movement has brought consent front and center in the discussion. Consent is what differentiates slavery from work, rape from lovemaking, theft from trade, and kidnapping from spending time at a friend's house. Consent is the root of morality. We should extend the principle of consent to the economic sphere, allowing the average person to have the most amount of job opportunities, the most amount of access to products and services that they could have. Embracing consent is not only the moral approach, it gives people a higher standard of living because you have entrepreneurs competing for the dollars in your pocket. Don't make it easy for them. Don't give them a big state that they could just tax the money away from you. Make them work for it.
Ben, what hope can socialism give them that it won't just become another failed experiment, but that it will genuinely improve their lives? In closing this segment, tell the younger generation why your vision isn't just an abstract ideal, but something that could actually make their lives and futures brighter, and why the other side's vision would not. You have 2 minutes.
Well, as those polls you quoted earlier show, a majority of young people already understand that what we've got right now has failed them. The thing that's failed them isn't the fact that they get to go to public school. I'll note, by the way, that argument we just heard against public school would equally be an argument against private schools, because, in fact, a much higher percentage of people in private schools feel the need to get 4 more years of education at the end, and somehow no rich people anywhere, right, encourage their kids to drop out at 16 when they're allowed to. So that's interesting to me, right? But they know that what's failed them is what is increasingly a form of capitalism that, however long the legal code is, however many dollars are in the overall government budget, has fewer protections of workers and consumers against capitalists doing whatever they want. They don't necessarily know what could or should replace them, this system, and many of them don't really believe deep down that anything could replace it. Capitalism just feels like the only way things could be, like it's part of the permanent fixture of reality. But slavery once felt like that. You'd be hard-pressed to find an abolitionist in ancient Rome, for example. Even most slaves wouldn't have thought that slavery was something that we could ever get past entirely. They might have dreamed of escaping or earning their individual freedom, but some people being masters and some people being slaves was just how the world was. Now we know it didn't have to be. And I would argue that some people being wealthy business owners and other people having to do what those two people told them all day isn't how things have to be either. But here's maybe the most essential point. Maybe you can't stretch your imagination to the point of thinking we could ever get rid of this system entirely. But even so, I think the majority of young people are realizing this part. Every incremental step we've taken in the direction of taking over society from wealthy business owners and running it in the interests of everyone makes our society better. We're better off when we take some of the wage setting authority away from capitalists with minimum wage laws. When we take some of their authority to decide how work processes get done with workplace safety laws. When we create those public schools and public libraries and public fire departments. Meanwhile, every step we take in the direction of a pure, more libertarian form of capitalism makes our society worse, makes it crueler and stupider and more unequal. Every privatization, every round of deregulation, every tax cut for rich people at the expense of slashing services for the poor. So whether or not you believe that we can make it all the way in my direction, let's at least hurry up and go some of that way.
And that concludes part 3. In part 4, the final round of tonight's debate, we'll hear closing arguments from each debater along with their rebuttals to their opponent's closing arguments. And that's coming up next, right after this message from our sponsor, JM Bullion.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion. At JM Bullion.
And we're back for closing arguments in tonight's debate on capitalism versus socialism. In this final round, each debater will have 5 minutes to make their closing arguments. I started with Keith in the last round, so let's start with Ben in this round. Ben, you have 5 minutes to make your closing arguments. The stage is yours.
Thank you. So I think that when we're thinking about the sort of big issue here about capitalism and socialism, it's important to take a long step back and think about all the different ways that society could be organized. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln was giving a speech about why the free labor system in the North was better than Southern slavery, which is, of course, something that Keith and I can get together on. But the interesting part is that even in 1861, Lincoln was sensitive to worries that the emerging system of industrial capitalism left something to be desired. He said that there is no such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. That line makes him sound like a socialist. He wasn't. His political vision was limited to, replacing slave labor with wage labor. But he acknowledged that the capitalist system wouldn't be a system of deep and genuine freedom if workers had to spend their whole lives as workers and could never afford to break out of that. But he insisted that this wouldn't be how it would go. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world could work as a hired laborer for a while. Then he could save up a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, work on his own account for a while, and eventually hire another new beginner to help him. And as much as I admire Lincoln, if we're honest about this, the idea that everyone who's sufficiently hardworking and prudent can be upwardly mobile through the class hierarchy was already wishful thinking in 1861. Even then, there were only so many lifeboats out of the working class. In 2025, I hope it's obvious to everyone that things can't work out the way that Lincoln was talking about for the majority of the population. The arithmetic doesn't work. In any technologically advanced modern economy, most labor is going to be done by groups of people working together. The world of small farmers and independent craftsmen is not coming back. And while class mobility, certainly exists, I wouldn't deny that, it's just not structurally possible for most of us to be capitalists any more than the laws of gravity would allow the majority of cheerleaders forming themselves into a pyramid to be at the top level. Our choices are that most people will work communally but be ruled by capitalists, right? Private business owners who can manage their little economic fiefdom like kings and queens, or that will continue to work communally but extend democracy to the half of our waking lives that most adults spend at work through some form of collective ownership. Now, Keith has argued throughout the debate that the sort of check that on capitalist power in the workplace is our freedom of exit. Right? You can always quit and get another job. But I would really suggest that this isn't going to take you that far. That in a lot of ways, this would be similar. If you think back to the way marriage laws used to work, there was something called coverture, where a lot of a married woman's rights would go to her husband after they got married, and she couldn't build up her own property and all of that. And if we still had that, but we also made divorce really easy, that would mean that sure, it would be easy to go from one husband with that kind of authority over you to a different husband with that kind of authority over you. You'd have that freedom of exit, but you wouldn't have voice in the arrangement itself. And that's a really crucial distinction. Never mind, of course, that, in both cases, workers now or wives back when this system was in place had to find a new master very quickly before their savings ran out. And of course, in the workplace case, if you apply your freedom of exit too many times, you've got a lot of embarrassing gaps on the resume, and it's going to be difficult to find your next position. So again, I think realistically, this is just not that kind of check that can do the level of work that Keith wants to make it do. Now, he talks a lot about voluntariness, right? The voluntary sector, for example, right? As his name for the private sector. But again, voluntariness in this context is just going to be a red herring. Any possible distribution of scarce resources is going to involve some sort of coercion to enforce that against people who are encroaching on whatever arrangement you've ended up with. So the real question is never voluntary or not voluntary. It's always, what's our theory of who should have what? Is it a Lockean theory where if you mix your labor with with nature, you thereby get rights to it, which I gotta say has never been very compelling to me. I mean, it's sort of it often feels like my dog's theory of property rights, which is that she acquires rights to things by relieving herself on them. Or is it going to be, for example, a Rawlsian theory, according to which the right distribution, the just distribution of resources is the one that you would choose if you ended up having the short end of the stick? I think it's the second one, or something much closer to that is going to be the more plausible theory. But this is the point I just want to end on. I think that's where the real debate lies, right? It's not about coercion versus no coercion. You're always, any kind of exclusion of some people from scarce resources is always going to rest on coercion. The important point is, what's the distribution that should be enforced? And I think a much more equal one is going to be much better for human dignity and flourishing.
And Keith, you have the last word. 5 minutes to make your closing arguments. The floor is yours.
When you look at the great crimes of, let's just stick with American history, it's commonly recognized that there were atrocities against the Native Americans. Some people initiated violence against other people, and we had an unjustifiable double standard. Well, it's not our fault. They were just savages, and we improved on the land, so initiating violence wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah, it's okay that we coerce some people into performing labor against their will, whether it's because they're less intelligent, because they come from less primitive societies. There was another blatant double standard that we are still paying for to this day. What capitalism's advocating is us dropping this double standard and not allowing some people to initiate aggression at the expense of others. Regardless of what your theory of property rights is, it's still inconsistent if there's a socialist state where one group has a unique right to initiate taxes against the rest of the population. That's what makes this an inconsistent theory. Even if you said, well, it's just about making sure there's enough for everyone. Well, then why is it that the state has a unique monopolistic right to initiate taxes? If it's something totally legitimate, allow everyone to initiate taxes. This was the great disagreement between George Fitzhugh in his book, The Sociology of the South, and Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Fitzhugh wrote in his book that slavery is a great paternal institution. Instead of the slave being free and then having to compete in the dog-eat-dog profit-seeking voluntary sector, the slave is taken care of. He's given a home for free. He's given a place where he can have a shower. He's given healthcare. He is under the ownership of the slave owner. This concept of voluntarism we should ignore and focus about really caring for people to the point of enslaving them. This is what I refer to as domestic imperialism. The progressive will rightfully say that America should not be using the government to enforce laws on people in Haiti. The government of Britain should not be forcing itself upon people in South Africa. Yet they say that that same government has the right to initiate coercion against its domestic population. It's the very principle of imperialism that they reject in a distant geographical area. They embrace it when it comes to people who happen to live in a closer geographical area. This is today's double standard that we need to reject. This is the double standard which allows people to fund mass murder campaigns in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, because we haven't taken this principle of voluntary exchange and extended it to members of the state. I'll end with a story out of Kansas City, Missouri. The health department is speaking out after it poured bleach on food intended to be given to the homeless. Nellie McCool, who helps run Free Hot Soup Kansas City, has been helping the homeless for years until Sunday. Quote, officers and health inspectors demanded we destroy our food, and we were violating the health code violations by sharing meals with our friends, said McCool. The department said the group wasn't following the law about serving the homeless. Quoting Dr. Rex Archer, the director for public health in Kansas City, Missouri. They were notified back in a meeting in September that they needed to get a permit, and they just outright said they refused to do that. McCool disputes that, claiming someone in their group got upset and threw food on the ground. Inspectors then poured bleach on the food to make sure no one ate it. That is the domestic imperialism you get with the state. When some people literally believe they have a better claim to the property you've justly acquired and your time and your body, and they separate themselves in an apartheid state where they have rights to do things to you, you don't have rights to do to them. That is the nature of our problem in society. We keep embracing double standards. It's time to embrace free market capitalism and reject double standards. Zero Hedge and Mr. Burgis, thank you guys for your time.
Thank
And
you.
before we wrap up tonight's debate, I want to personally thank both debaters for their maturity and professionalism. We had no ad hominem attacks. I didn't have to do anything as moderator to moderate any disputes, and I really respect both of you for coming to such a heated topic with such a respectful approach. Before we close, I want to invite both of you to share your X handles, website URLs, and so forth for the benefit of any listeners who may want to follow your work. Professor Ben Burgis, where can people follow your work and what will they find when they get there?
Sure, you can read me at Jacobin Magazine, where I'm a columnist, or at my Substack, which is called Philosophy for the People. That's benburgis.substack.com. My podcast is called Give Them an Argument, and that is every Monday night at 8 p.m. on the East Coast, so 5 on the West Coast where I am. And you can pretty much find what you heard tonight.
And Keith, please tell our listeners where they can follow your work and what they'll find when they get there.
For people interested in the libertarian philosophy or the philosophy of social cooperation in opposition to violence and coercion, they can check out libertarianinstitute.org, where we have a free educational online archive. You can use our search engine to type in any issue you're interested in: agricultural subsidies, central banks, Israel, Ukraine, and you can check out all the free materials we have there. You can also find free PDFs of my 2 books. One is the Voluntarist Handbook, the 50 articles and essays that I read, which took me from being a progressive to being a libertarian, as well as a speech I gave titled Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. That is where I quoted the previous article from. Thank you guys so much for your time. You can also check out my podcast, Don't Tread on Anyone, on YouTube and Odyssey.
And for my part in this, Macro Voices is the only investment and macroeconomics podcast that specifically targets professional finance, family offices, and sophisticated private investors. We differentiate from other podcasts by asking all of our guests not to dumb it down to a retail level. You can subscribe to Macro Voices wherever you get your podcasts, or find more information at macrovoices.com. And for those of you, and I know you are, who've been eyeing that beautiful Zero Hedge ball cap over my shoulder, you can find that and a whole bunch of other really cool Zero Hedge merch at zhstore.com. For the Zero Hedge debate series, I'm Eric Townsend.
Okay.
right.
All right. What a debate. I missed a little bit of it, but did he ever answer the question how an institute has an editor-in-chief? Because that's mostly what I was curious about. I don't think so.
Did
Right?
not, but
Okay.
he did mention how much he's taxed, and that would put him at making about $250,000 a year. So apparently he's got a good paycheck.
I might reach out to him. I'm actually kind of having a change of heart hearing that because I'm in a different tax. Advocating for socialism has not done the same thing to my tax bracket. Anyway, if you're just joining us, that was a debate that Ben previously recorded, and now that it's wrapped up, we are going to end the main show early, but we are going to do a post game. Ben is currently flying all over the country to head to another debate because he knows you all want more content. So he is going to go wherever he has to go, debate whoever he has to, whatever charming people want to.
He's going from door to door.
He's
door to door, just asking for debates.
He'll debate your grandma. If your grandma wants to debate Ben will debate her. But yeah, so we're going to wrap the main show early because Ben is not here, but we are going to have a post game with, tell us about the guests we're going to have in the post game, Andy.
Yeah, we have Noam Schatz from the Lucky Shots, which is a great local band. I've got into them because I'm friends with the guitarist that's in the band, and it's just great songwriting, kind of Americana rock and roll. Just really good stuff with great guitar solos.
Yes, awesome. Well, we're going to be talking to them. I see a comment that my audio's off, so I'll do my best. For the Patreon subscribers, hopefully you'll get the good audio. No, the post game is available for patrons, of which the money that you are so generous to donate keeps this show going. We'll start that. Do you know we'll be on earlier? You think probably at 10, Andy, based on your guest.
I mean, he's already in the chat, so I mean, he's already ready to go. So
okay, so all right, so maybe in like 10-15 minutes we'll start. We'll start the post game a little bit early, but we're going to take a break. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of GTAA. And there's only one more thing to say: left is best.